The year was 1878, and a heavy quiet hung over the St. Louis church. Sunlight, thick with dust motes, slanted through tall windows, illuminating the faces of the congregation. They sat in neat rows, their Sunday best a sea of muted colors, listening to the new pastor's sermon. It was a solemn service, much like any other, until a sound ripped through the air. It wasn't a cough or a dropped hymn book. It was a raw, guttural scream tearing from the back of the church. He was a man known to everyone, though few knew his name anymore. He was simply the Silent Man, a fixture in the community for years, his presence marked only by his stillness. But now, that stillness was broken. His head was thrown back, eyes wide, and a sound that felt ancient and full of pain echoed off the wooden beams. It was the first sound he had uttered in years, a lifetime it seemed to some. The congregation, startled, turned as one, a ripple of whispers starting to spread. Before anyone could fully process what had happened, Deacon Elijah stepped forward. He was a man of imposing stature, his voice booming with authority, a prominent figure in the church and the community. "Silence," he commanded, his words cutting through the rising murmur. He looked at the screaming man with disdain. "This is clearly a demonic possession. The devil has taken hold of this poor soul." His voice dripped with self-righteousness, designed to shame and condemn. The man, still trembling, slowly sank back onto the pew, his scream dying into a choked sob. Faces in the pews hardened, fear and judgment quickly replacing shock. But then, a different figure moved. The newly arrived Christian pastor, a man whose presence was quiet but firm, walked towards the silent man. He didn't rush, didn't preach, didn't condemn. His steps were measured, his gaze unwavering, fixed on the man. It was a calculated move, one that silenced the congregation more effectively than the deacon's booming voice. The whispers died down, replaced by an uneasy silence. Everyone watched, unsure what to expect. The pastor didn't say much at first. He simply stood before the man, his eyes holding a depth of understanding that seemed to cut through the noise of the room. Then, in a voice that carried to every corner, yet remained gentle, he spoke a single powerful phrase that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. "The silenced shall find their voice." A new murmur began, different this time, not of fear or judgment, but of curiosity, perhaps even a flicker of hope. Some remembered hushed tales about the silent man, whispers of an injustice, a long-forgotten trauma that had stolen his words. It was a deeper story, they knew, than simple possession, a story of something broken, something taken. The pastor slowly extended his hand, palm open, a gesture of peace and invitation. The silent man looked at it, his eyes still wide, filled with a mixture of fear and something else. A flicker of recognition, maybe. His own hand, gnarled and trembling, slowly lifted. It hovered in the air, his fingers almost, but not quite, touching the pastor's. The entire church held its breath, wondering what truth would emerge from this fragile connection, what hidden story was about to be told. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. This dramatic scene in the church was far from the beginning of the silent man's story. To truly understand the weight of that scream, we need to go back to a different St. Louis, a city bustling with life in the late 1870s. It was a place of stark contrasts, where grand new buildings rose alongside crowded, often neglected neighborhoods. For the city's African-American community, life was a delicate balance of resilience and struggle, often within their own self-sufficient communities. In one such close-knit neighborhood lived Thomas. He wasn't always the silent man everyone knew. He was a carpenter, skillfully shaping wood with his hands, his work known for its quality and strength. Thomas was a man of quiet dignity. He didn't boast or seek attention, but his presence was always felt, a steady hand in the community. His hands, usually busy with a hammer or saw, were a testament to his dedication, not just to his craft, but to his family and his church. His life revolved around simple, honest things. He loved his wife, Sarah, with a deep, unwavering devotion. Their 2 children, a boy and a girl, were the light of his life. Their laughter the sweetest sound he knew. Providing for them, seeing them grow healthy and strong, was his biggest dream. He wanted them to have a better life, to know security and respect. He poured his heart into his work, not just for the money, but for the pride of creating something lasting, something useful for his people. Thomas was also a man of faith, deeply rooted in his church. It wasn't just a building, it was the heart of his community, a place of solace, strength, and shared purpose. He trusted the people there, especially those he considered leaders. His vulnerabilities, you see, stemmed from this very trust. He believed in the good intentions of others, in the shared goals of lifting their community. He never doubted that those he looked up to would uphold their promises and act with integrity. His dreams were simple: to be a good husband and father, a skilled craftsman, and a contributing member of his church. He wanted to build a life, literally and figuratively, that would stand strong against the challenges of the world. This is where Deacon Elijah enters the story, not as a villain, not yet. At first, Elijah was a respected, influential figure within that same church and community. He was older, well-spoken, and seemed to possess a wisdom that Thomas admired. Elijah had a way of presenting himself as a pillar of the community, a man who cared deeply for his flock. He often took Thomas under his wing, offering advice, praising his carpentry skills, and even suggesting joint ventures that would benefit the church. To Thomas, Deacon Elijah was more than just a church leader. He was a mentor, a man to emulate. Thomas held a deep respect for Elijah, seeing him as a guiding force, someone who understood the struggles and aspirations of their community. This initial relationship, built on trust and admiration, was crucial. It created the foundation, a seemingly solid ground upon which the eventual conflict would be built. Thomas's unwavering belief in Elijah's good character, his willingness to follow his lead, made him particularly susceptible to the deeper, more insidious betrayals that were to come. He saw no reason to question the man who appeared to be working for the betterment of everyone, especially those closest to him in faith. The cracks in that seemingly solid foundation didn't appear all at once. They formed slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, like tiny fissures in old wood. Thomas, with his honest nature, saw them as misunderstandings, minor bumps in the road, never as deliberate acts of malice. He wanted to believe in the best of Deacon Elijah, to hold on to the image of the benevolent mentor. One of the first noticeable shifts came with business ventures. Elijah would propose community projects like building new benches for the church or repairing homes for the elderly. Thomas would put in the hours, often supplying materials at cost, sometimes even free because it was for the community, for God. But then, when the time came for payment or recognition, Elijah would always have an excuse. Funds were delayed or redirected or simply vanished. Thomas would get a fraction of what he was owed, or sometimes nothing at all, while Elijah would publicly take full credit for the project's success. He'd stand before the congregation, beaming, accepting praise for what Thomas's hands had built. Thomas, too proud and too trusting to make a scene, would just nod, a quiet ache starting in his chest. Then there were the spiritual guidance sessions. Elijah would call Thomas aside, often after a particularly long day of work, and offer advice that felt less like guidance and more like veiled criticism. He'd talk about humility, about not seeking worldly rewards, subtly implying that Thomas's quiet ambition to provide well for his family was somehow less spiritual than Elijah's own grand pronouncements. These talks chipped away at Thomas's self-worth. He started to question his own motives, wondering if his desire for a better life for Sarah and the children was indeed a flaw. Elijah was very good at making Thomas feel small, less worthy, even as he claimed to be lifting him up. These weren't isolated incidents. They were a pattern. Elijah would subtly undermine Thomas's reputation within the church. If Thomas offered an idea during a community meeting, Elijah would either ignore it or later present it as his own, slightly altered, securing the credit. If Thomas spoke passionately about a need in the community, Elijah would nod. Then later, in a private conversation with another elder, he'd express concern about Thomas's overenthusiasm or lack of practical experience. These were small, almost invisible cuts, but they added up. Thomas started to notice how Elijah would always find a way to make himself look good at someone else's expense. When a large donation came in for the church, Elijah was the one to announce it, positioning himself as the key figure in securing it. Even if Thomas had done the legwork of finding the donor, Thomas would often see his own hard work, his own ideas, his own quiet contributions, repackaged and presented as Elijah's triumphs. The emotional abuse was slow, insidious. It wasn't a shouting match or a public confrontation. It was a slow drip of broken promises, veiled humiliations, and subtle manipulations that wore down Thomas's spirit. He felt a constant pressure, a vague sense of being less than, even when he knew in his heart he was doing right. He began to doubt himself, to second-guess his own judgment. The trust he had once placed so freely in Elijah started to curdle into a bitter confusion. His initial outburst, that guttural scream in the church, wasn't a sudden explosion. It was the culmination of years of this psychological wear and tear, a final straw after enduring a relentless campaign of injustice. Every time Thomas had swallowed his pride, every time he had excused Elijah's behavior, every time he had doubted himself instead of the deacon, he was building up to that moment. He was a man who had been pushed past his limits, his spirit stretched thin, until it finally snapped under the immense weight of silent suffering. The atmosphere around Thomas became heavy, almost suffocating. What had started as subtle slights and quiet manipulations from Elijah now began to escalate into more open conflicts. Arguments over church funds, once handled discreetly, now spilled into public view. Thomas, who had always been meticulous with the community's money, found his integrity questioned by Elijah during a heated church council meeting. Elijah, with his booming voice and confident posture, suggested that funds for a new roof, which Thomas had been managing, were not being allocated efficiently. He didn't outright accuse Thomas of theft, but his insinuations were clear enough to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of others. Property disputes also intensified. A piece of land that Thomas had helped secure for a community garden, a place intended to provide fresh produce for struggling families, suddenly became a point of contention. Elijah claimed he had a better plan for the land, one that involved a more profitable venture for the church, subtly implying Thomas's vision was small-minded and impractical. These discussions, meant for community betterment, devolved into bitter arguments, with Elijah always positioning himself as the financially savvy leader and Thomas as the well-meaning but misguided idealist. The social pressure on Thomas from within the church congregation grew immensely. Elijah was a master at subtle persuasion. He wouldn't directly badmouth Thomas, but he would have quiet conversations with key members, expressing concerns about Thomas's judgment or his stubbornness. He'd lament about how Thomas just didn't see the bigger picture or was too set in his ways. These quiet whispers spread like wildfire through the close-knit community. Soon, Thomas noticed a shift. Nods of greeting became less enthusiastic. Conversations would stop abruptly when he approached, and some parishioners started to avoid his gaze entirely. Elijah's posturing became increasingly aggressive and self-serving. He started holding more impromptu meetings, often excluding Thomas, where he would outline his grand visions for the church and community, always contrasting them implicitly with Thomas's more understated, practical approach. He made sure to be seen as the driving force behind every positive development, while any setbacks or challenges were subtly linked to Thomas's previous involvement or suggestions. This systematic isolation made Thomas feel like an outsider in his own church, a place that had once been his sanctuary. Thomas felt the immense weight of judgment from all sides. Neighbors who had once shared meals and laughter with his family now offered only curt greetings or averted their eyes. Fellow parishioners, once allies in various church projects, now seemed distant, their faces a mixture of suspicion and pity. Even distant relatives, hearing the rumors and seeing the change in social dynamics, started to keep their distance, wary of being associated with someone who seemed to be falling out of favor with the powerful deacon Elijah. This period marked the peak of emotional suffocation for Thomas. He would walk through the streets of his neighborhood, once so familiar and comforting, now feeling a constant sense of unease. He saw the doubt in people's eyes, heard the hushed conversations that stopped as he passed. He felt utterly alone, despite being surrounded by the community he had dedicated his life to. The relentless campaign of psychological pressure, the public questioning of his character, and the gradual shunning by his own people left him feeling hollowed out. He tried to defend himself at first, to explain his actions, to clarify the financial records, to present his vision for the community garden, but his words seemed to fall on deaf ears, overshadowed by Elijah's eloquent pronouncements and the pervasive whispers of doubt. Every attempt to clear his name only seemed to dig him deeper into a hole of misunderstanding. The burden of this constant judgment, the feeling of being unfairly maligned, became unbearable. It was during this time that Thomas began his slow, painful withdrawal. The world, once vibrant and full of purpose, started to close in around him, pushing him towards the silence that would eventually consume him entirely. The emotional suffocation reached its absolute limit for Thomas. One evening, a small handwritten ledger left carelessly on a pew after a late church meeting caught his eye. It was open to a page filled with numbers that didn't quite add up to what he remembered from the orphanage fund reports. A cold dread settled in his stomach. He picked it up, his fingers trembling slightly. This wasn't the official church ledger, but a personal one, meticulously kept by Deacon Elijah. As Thomas flipped through the pages, a sickening truth began to unfold. It was all there in Elijah's own neat handwriting, dates, amounts, and coded notations that, when deciphered, painted a clear picture of embezzlement. Funds specifically earmarked for the community's orphanage, money Thomas had personally helped raise through tireless efforts, through countless hours of carpentry work for donations, through organizing bake sales and charity drives, were being systematically siphoned off, not small amounts but significant sums, redirected to Elijah's personal accounts, disguised as administrative fees or unforeseen expenses. The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the sheer audacity, the desecration of a sacred trust. The orphanage was a beacon of hope for so many children in their community, a place meant to shelter and nurture the most vulnerable. To steal from them, to use their plight for personal gain, was a cruelty Thomas had never imagined possible from someone he had once respected, even looked up to. This wasn't just a disagreement over church policy or a misunderstanding of finances. This was outright theft, a moral crime of the highest order. He confronted Elijah, not in private, but during a small gathering of church elders, hoping the presence of others would force the deacon to confess, or at least explain. Thomas held the ledger, his voice barely a whisper, filled with a raw, desperate pain. He laid out the evidence, pointing to the discrepancies, the hidden transfers, the direct links to Elijah's own properties. He pleaded with Elijah to explain, to offer some reason, some justification for such a heinous act. But Elijah, ever the master manipulator, didn't flinch. He looked at Thomas with an expression of feigned pity, then turned to the other elders with a sardonic smile. He dismissed Thomas's accusations as the ravings of a troubled mind, claiming Thomas was clearly unstable and confused by numbers. He even implied that Thomas himself might be trying to cover up his own misdeeds by pointing fingers, suggesting that perhaps the ledger was a forgery planted by Thomas to discredit him. The other elders, already influenced by Elijah's long campaign against Thomas, exchanged uneasy glances. They saw Thomas, a man who had been increasingly isolated and shamed, now making wild accusations against their respected deacon. They didn't see the pain in Thomas's eyes, only what Elijah wanted them to see. A man unraveling. Elijah's public shaming of Thomas, right there in front of the elders, was the final crushing blow. In that moment, something inside Thomas snapped. He saw the futility of words, the powerlessness of truth against a well-crafted lie, especially when delivered by someone with authority. He saw how easily people could be swayed, how quickly trust could erode. He realized that speaking out, fighting back with words, only gave Elijah more ammunition, more opportunities to twist the narrative and further isolate him. So, Thomas made a profound decision. He would stop speaking. He would withdraw completely. He would become utterly silent. It wasn't about giving up. It was about reclaiming control. It was a form of protest, a silent scream against the injustice, a refusal to participate in a system that allowed such deceit to flourish. It was also a form of self-preservation, a way to protect the last vestiges of his dignity from further assault. If his words were worthless, then silence would be his shield, his weapon. This act of silence, this complete cessation of communication, broke the cycle of suffering in a way that no argument or plea ever could. It fundamentally shifted the narrative. From that day forward, Thomas no longer engaged with Elijah's accusations, no longer defended himself against the whispers. He simply existed, a silent testament to a truth no one else seemed willing to hear. This profound withdrawal would set the stage for the arrival of the new pastor, paving the way for the unexpected events that would unfold, beginning with that guttural scream in the church. Thomas's silence was a heavy blanket, not just for him, but for his entire family. The days after his confrontation with Elijah blurred into a monotonous cycle of internal struggle. He felt a constant knot in his stomach, a mix of fear and deep shame. Fear of what Elijah might do next, what other lies he would concoct. Shame because he knew the truth, yet the community saw him as unstable, perhaps even guilty. His children, once lively and outgoing, became withdrawn. They started avoiding playmates, their laughter replaced by hushed tones and watchful eyes. His wife, a strong woman who had always been his rock, grew pale and thin, the worry etched into her face. She tried to talk to him, to coax words from him, but his lips remained sealed. He communicated mostly through gestures or by writing short, clipped notes. It was a painful existence for all of them. The hardship wasn't just emotional, it was practical. Thomas, once a respected carpenter, found his work drying up. People started avoiding him, their eyes darting away when he approached. Church members, once friendly, now offered cold nods or simply ignored him altogether. The economic impact was immediate and severe. His family, once comfortable, began to struggle to put food on the table. He saw the hunger in his children's eyes, and it tore at him, deepening his despair. He had tried to protect them, but his silence had brought them only more suffering. Among his former friends, a few, swayed by Elijah's narrative, turned into active antagonists. They spread rumors, adding fuel to the fire. He always was a bit odd, one would whisper, loud enough for others to hear. Too proud for his own good, another might add, probably stole the money himself and is now pretending to be crazy. These words, though not directed at him verbally, reached Thomas through the glances and hushed conversations that followed him everywhere. He felt like a ghost, present but unseen, unheard. Yet, not everyone turned their back. A few, a very few, offered quiet support. There was Mrs. Henderson, an elderly churchgoer with kind eyes and a gentle spirit. She would sometimes leave a small basket of fresh vegetables on his doorstep, never saying a word, just a fleeting, sympathetic smile. Old Man Johnson, a retired laborer who lived down the street, would occasionally stop by and sit with Thomas on his porch, not asking questions, just offering a silent companionship that was more comforting than any words could be. These small acts of kindness were like tiny flickering candles in the overwhelming darkness. The cultural dynamics of 1870 St. Louis played a huge part in Thomas's isolation. In their close-knit community, especially within the church, a person's standing was everything. Reputation was currency. To be accused, even indirectly, by a figure like Deacon Elijah was a social death sentence. Thomas's silence, instead of being seen as a protest, was often interpreted as either guilt or madness. Why doesn't he defend himself if he's innocent? People wondered. He must have something to hide. The weight of this misunderstanding was immense. The psychological impact on Thomas was profound. He felt a deep, crushing isolation. His world shrank to the walls of his home, and even there, a barrier existed between him and his family. He often sat for hours, staring blankly, his mind replaying the events, searching for a different path he could have taken. He questioned everything, his faith, his judgment, his very being. Despair settled over him like a thick fog, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. He was a man trapped in his own head, his voice locked away, a prisoner of his own silent protest. The new pastor, observant and patient, didn't push Thomas. He understood that healing wasn't a race, but a slow, careful journey. He spent weeks simply listening to the whispers in the community, piecing together the broken fragments of Thomas's story. He visited Mrs. Henderson, who, emboldened by the pastor's gentle demeanor, shared her observations about Deacon Elijah's sudden wealth and Thomas's quiet despair. Old Man Johnson, too, offered his perspective, describing how Elijah had systematically undermined Thomas for years. The pastor didn't stop there. He began a quiet investigation, discreetly looking into the church's financial records, particularly those related to the orphanage fund. He found discrepancies, small at first, then larger, pointing to a pattern of embezzlement. The discovery was like pulling a loose thread, and soon the entire fabric of Elijah's deceit began to unravel. The pastor cross-referenced old ledgers, spoke to suppliers, and even tracked down former church members who had moved away, all of whom confirmed unsettling details about Elijah's dealings. The evidence mounted, undeniable and damning. He found receipts for materials never delivered to the orphanage, inflated invoices and bank records showing large sums transferred from the church fund to Elijah's personal accounts. It was all there, laid bare, corroborating Thomas's silent protest in a way No words ever could. The pastor, armed with this irrefutable proof, knew he had to act. He called for a special church meeting, a somber gathering where the entire community was present. Deacon Elijah, still projecting an air of self-righteousness, sat confidently, unaware of the trap closing around him. The pastor, with a heavy heart, presented his findings. He spoke calmly, detailing each instance of fraud, each stolen penny, each broken trust. As he laid out the evidence, a hush fell over the congregation, broken only by gasps of disbelief and murmurs of betrayal. Elijah, cornered, tried to deny it, to spin tales of misunderstanding and administrative errors. But the pastor had anticipated this, producing the physical evidence, the signed documents, the bank statements that left no room for doubt. The community, once swayed by Elijah's polished words, now saw him for what he truly was, a deceitful man who had preyed on their trust and their children's future. The consequence for Deacon Elijah was swift and absolute. He was publicly stripped of his deacon title, expelled from the church, and faced the full weight of community scorn. His reputation, once so meticulously built, crumbled to dust. He left St. Louis shortly after, a disgraced and broken man. Thomas was present at that meeting, sitting quietly in the back. He didn't speak, not even a single word. But when the pastor finished and the truth hung heavy in the air, Thomas slowly rose. He walked to the front, not to speak, but to hand the pastor a single, neatly folded piece of paper. On it, in his precise carpenter's hand, were written just a few lines. "The orphanage funds were stolen. I saw it. I tried to tell you. Thank you for listening." It wasn't a speech. It wasn't an outburst. But it was his voice, clear and unwavering. It was a symbolic act, a quiet declaration that affirmed his truth and validated his suffering. The community looked at him, not with pity, but with a newfound respect and understanding. In the weeks and months that followed, Thomas slowly began to rebuild his life. His family's reputation was restored, and the community, humbled by their own misjudgment, offered apologies and support. Work, slowly at first, began to return. People sought out his skilled hands, not just for carpentry, but for his quiet integrity. He never became a verbose man, but his silence was no longer a burden. It was a testament to his strength. The pastor often reflected on the power of Thomas's silent suffering. It had been a difficult path, but truth eventually had triumphed. The story of Thomas became a quiet lesson for Saint Papa Louis, a reminder of the importance of empathy, justice, and the courage to look beyond the surface, to truly listen even to those who cannot speak. Thomas, though forever changed, found a quiet peace, his family whole again, and his voice finally heard.